In the shadowed halls of a medieval court, a young queen stood alone, her wedding vows drowned by whispers of treachery. Was Isabella of France a pawn ensnared by fate, or a predator who forged her own path through a kingdom's ruin? History brands her the she-wolf, a name born from a venomous campaign that sought to reduce her to a creature of depravity, accused of unspeakable acts, her very humanity questioned. Yet beneath these vile slanders lay a darker truth, a woman who wielded lies as weapons, turning shame into power. The tale of Isabella is no mere chronicle. It is a descent into the abyss of ambition, vengeance, and the cost of defying a world ruled by men. A story long buried in the annals of England awaits revelation. If this dark journey intrigues, consider subscribing and sharing thoughts on the price of power in the comments below. In the early 14th century, England's court was a crucible of ambition, where loyalty was a fleeting coin and power a perilous prize. Amidst this treacherous landscape emerged Isabella, daughter of France's iron-willed Philip IV, wedded to Edward II at the tender age of 13. Her arrival promised unity, yet delivered isolation, as the king's favour fell to favourites who mocked her dignity. Behind the pomp of coronation, a darker tale unfolded, one of a queen who, scorned and slandered, forged her humiliation into a weapon. This is no mere chronicle of royalty, but a descent into the machinations of a woman who defied her era's chains. Her journey from a neglected bride to a regent cloaked in infamy reveals the cost of power in a world ruled by men. What drove her to such lengths, and what truths lie buried in her legacy? In the shadowed halls of Dover Castle, a young queen stepped onto English soil, her silks trailing like whispers of a forgotten promise. Isabella of France, barely 13, arrived in 1308 to wed Edward II, her marriage a fragile thread meant to bind England and France. Yet, at the coronation feast, the air grew thick with betrayal. Edward's eyes, alight with reckless devotion, lingered not on his bride, but on Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whose smirk mocked the crown itself. The court watched, their murmurs sharp as daggers, as Isabella stood alone, a political ornament cast aside in her husband's gaze. This was no mere slight, but a public wound, one that branded her as powerless in a realm where power was all. Isabella, daughter of Philip IV, was no stranger to the machinations of courts. Raised in the iron grip of French royalty, she bore the weight of her lineage with a quiet resolve. Yet England's court was a labyrinth of treachery, its nobles circling like wolves scenting weakness. Gaveston, elevated to dizzying heights as Edward's favourite, flaunted his influence, gifting the Queen's jewels to his own coffers while the king acquiesced. The insult was brazen, yet Isabella did not weep. Instead, her gaze grew cold, her mind a silent ledger, cataloguing every slight, every whispered alliance, every crack in the court's fragile unity. In the dim glow of candlelit chambers, she studied her enemies, her youth masking a will as unyielding as steel. The barons, too, simmered with discontent, their loyalty to Edward eroded by Gaveston's arrogance. Isabella, though isolated, was no passive observer. She noted the factions forming, the whispers of rebellion, the fragile egos of men who underestimated her. Each night, as the palace slept, her thoughts sharpened, her humiliation forging a resolve that burned beneath her serene facade. This young queen, dismissed as a child, was learning the language of power in a tongue her detractors could not yet fathom. Her silence was not surrender, but a gathering storm. Yet this was but the prelude to a darker game, one where slander would become her battlefield. In the shadowed corridors of Westminster, a new venom seeped into the air, as sharp and insidious as a winter frost. By 1312, Piers Gaveston's head had rolled, severed by baronial wrath. Yet Isabella's reprieve was fleeting. A new adversary emerged. Hugh de Spencer, a cunning courtier whose ambition rivaled the devil's own. With Edward II's ear and a heart unburdened by scruple, de Spencer wove a tapestry of lies to dismantle the Queen's honour. Whispers spread through the court, venomous and grotesque. Isabella, they claimed, was no mere queen, but a sorceress, a creature of pagan rites, who consorted with beasts under moonlit skies. These slanders, absurd yet relentless, painted her as a monstrous aberration, unfit for the throne she graced. The court, ever hungry for scandal, lapped up the tales. De Spencer's words were a calculated poison, designed to isolate Isabella further, to strip her of allies and dignity. Yet where others might have crumbled, Isabella stood unbowed. In the echoing halls of the palace, her footsteps rang with purpose, her smile a blade that turned slander into jest. She did not deny the accusations outright, for to do so would grant them weight. Instead, she strode through the court, her gaze defiant, her poise a silent mockery of her accuser's crude inventions. The whispers faltered, their absurdity laid bare by her unshaken dignity. De Spencer's campaign, though vicious, began to fray at its edges. The tales of witchcraft and depravity grew so fantastical that even his allies, men swayed by greed or fear, began to question their truth. A baron's sidelong glance, a murmured doubt, these were the first cracks in de Spencer's edifice of lies. Isabella, ever watchful, noted each shift, her mind a chessboard where every move was calculated. She was no longer the child queen of 1308. Humiliation had forged her into something sharper, more dangerous. Her enemies, blinded by their own malice, failed to see the storm gathering in her silence. But this was no mere defiance. It was the prelude to a reckoning that would shake the foundations of England's crown. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of London's great halls, a queen's defiance took root, as unyielding as the stone that bore her footsteps. By 1315, Isabella of France had shed the guise of the silent bride. The slanders of Hugh de Spencer, once venomous, now teetered on absurdity. Tales of witchcraft and beastly rites so outlandish that even the court's most craven sycophants began to waver. Where scorn had once stung, it now fueled her resolve. Isabella's gaze, once a quiet ledger of weaknesses, now burned with a confidence that unnerved her foes. She moved through the court like a spectre, her presence a silent challenge to those who dared brand her a monster. Each step, each glance, turned their contempt into a weapon of her own making. Yet England's air grew stifling, the court a cage of treachery. In 1324, fate, or folly, offered a key. Edward II, desperate to quell tensions with France, dispatched Isabella to Paris to negotiate peace. It was a grave miscalculation. Stepping onto her native soil, Isabella stood taller, her eyes alight with the fire of a daughter of France. Paris was no mere refuge. It was a stage where she could reclaim her power. With the elegance of a seasoned diplomat, she wove alliances, her charm disarming those who had underestimated her. The French court, once her childhood home, now bent to her will, its lords and envoys captivated by a queen reborn. Her boldest stroke came in 1325, when she persuaded Edward II to send their son, Edward III, to join her in France. This was no mere maternal act, but a gambit to shield the heir from Despencer's grasping reach. In the candlelit chambers of Paris, Isabella stood as both mother and strategist, her son's safety a bulwark against her enemy's designs. The boy, barely 12, was now beyond the English court's venom, a piece secured on her chessboard. With each move, Isabella's vision sharpened, her humiliation a distant memory replaced by the cold clarity of ambition. Yet this was no mere escape. It was the forging of a blade, one that would soon cut through the heart of a kingdom. In the shadowed courts of Paris, a queen's heart beat with rebellion, its rhythm echoing through the halls of history. By 1325, Isabella of France had found not just refuge, but a partner in defiance, Roger Mortimer, a disgraced noble whose exile burned with a hunger for retribution. Their alliance, forged in whispers and sealed in scandal, was more than a union of lovers. It was a pact of iron, binding two souls who sought to shatter a kingdom's chains. Together, they turned the court's murmurs of she-wolf into a banner of defiance, wielding scandal as a blade against their foes. Isabella, once slandered, now embraced the moniker, her voice ringing clear as she branded Despencer the true wolf, a predator preying on England's soul. Her defiance became a clarion call. Refusing Edward II's summons to return, Isabella stood firm in France, her words a gauntlet thrown at the feet of a faltering king. With Mortimer at her side, she rallied an army, exiles, mercenaries, and disaffected nobles, united by her cause. In September 1326, her fleet landed at Suffolk, the sea's roar heralding a queen transformed. Nobles and commoners alike knelt before her, their faith in Edward eroded by years of misrule. Isabella, once reviled as a monster, now rode as a saviour, her banners snapping in the autumn wind. Edward and Despencer fled, their cowardice a stark confession of the weakness she had long proclaimed. Vengeance came swiftly. Captured, Despencer faced a trial steeped in the cruelty he had sown. His execution, in 1326, was a spectacle of horror. Drawn, quartered, his blood a grim testament to Isabella's wrath. Edward II, stripped of his crown, abdicated to his son, Edward III, in early 1327. His mysterious death soon after, cloaked in whispers of murder, bore the mark of Isabella's hand, though no proof ever surfaced. The queen had turned slander into sovereignty, her enemies' lies into their own undoing. Yet, this triumph, so fiercely won, cast a shadow longer than her reign. For even as she stood victorious, the seeds of a new reckoning were sown in the eyes of her son. In the twilight of her triumph, Isabella of France stood atop a throne, forged from the ashes of her enemies, her crown a testament to a will unbroken. As regent for her son, Edward III, she wielded power few women of her age could claim, yet the title of she-wolf clung to her, a shadow cast by both foes and admirers. Her journey, from a scorned bride to a queen who shattered a kingdom's chains, reveals a truth as enduring as it is unsettling. Power, when seized in defiance of fate, exacts a price no crown can conceal. Isabella's victories, steeped in treachery and blood, reshaped England's destiny, yet her rule was fleeting. By 1330, Edward III, now grown, turned his gaze upon his mother, his ambition a silent challenge to her dominion. The queen who had defied a king found herself eclipsed by her own heir. What legacy, then, does Isabella leave? A tale of cunning and vengeance, where slander became a sword and humiliation a spur. Her story whispers a timeless question. Does power, won through such shadowed means, ever truly endure? History offers no easy answers, only the echo of her name, both cursed and revered. For those drawn to the shadows of the past, like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Isabella's saga, like the truths it unveils, lingers, an enigma wrapped in the mists of a bygone age.